Welcome to this explainer. Today I'm putting on my EU environmental law expert hat, and I'm honestly thrilled to guide you through what is literally a monumental shift in European legislation. We're decoding Directive EU 2025/1892. Now, if you operate in the European market, especially in the food or textile sectors, you really can't just skim over this update. This is a fundamental, structural rewrite of how the European Union handles waste. We are talking about shifting massive financial and operational responsibilities straight onto producers. So I'm going to walk you through exactly what these changes mean, how they'll impact supply chains, and why the days of just dodging the environmental costs of production are, well, officially over. Here's our roadmap for today's briefing. First up, we'll look at the philosophical shift to the new circular economy. Second, we'll analyze the binding reduction targets for the food sector. Third, we'll dive right into extended producer responsibility in textiles. Fourth, we'll cover the new obligations for online platforms. And finally, we'll wrap up with the compliance timeline and next steps. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the new circular economy, and how we are moving away from the linear economy. So the EU is aggressively targeting its most resource-intensive sectors to fix what economists call negative environmental externalities. To put that into perspective, food and textiles are the first and fourth most resource-intensive sectors in the EU, respectively. For decades, they've basically operated on this linear take, make, dispose model. Well, this directive is the exact legal instrument designed to dismantle that entirely. Looking at the legal text of the preamble, it formally anchors this shift. The EU is explicitly stating that the status quo, especially those business models built around fast fashion and high-waste food production, is just no longer legally or environmentally viable. We're moving toward a circular model where prevention, reuse, and recycling aren't just strongly encouraged anymore, they are legally mandated. Moving on to Section 2, legally binding food waste targets. You know, for years, progress on those voluntary UN food waste goals was just way too slow. So the EU has finally stepped in. And what's really fascinating here is how the new law actually bifurcates the responsibility. The directive establishes two distinct targets, and these are compared to a 2021 to 2023 baseline average. Down in processing and manufacturing, member states have to achieve a 10% reduction in food waste. But then, look at the other side of the coin. For retail, restaurants, and households, that target jumps to a massive 30% per capita reduction. It brilliantly illustrates this whole concept of shared responsibility. The law basically recognizes that waste happens very differently at a factory level than it does at your local supermarket or your dinner table. So it's demanding targeted action across the entire supply chain. And the absolutely crucial point to remember here is this number, 2030. December 31st, 2030, to be exact. This isn't a suggestion. It's the hard, legally binding deadline for member states to actually achieve these reductions. The clock is officially ticking. To hit that 2030 deadline, the directive mandates that member states roll out some very specific measures. They literally can't just run a couple of awareness campaigns and call it a day anymore. The law requires real behavioral change interventions. It requires tackling those systemic supply chain inefficiencies head-on. But perhaps most importantly from a legal standpoint, it explicitly demands that we prioritize food donation for human consumption over using it for animal feed or reprocessing. The law is actively stepping in to protect food banks and make sure edible food goes to people first. On top of that, it pushes for cool technological solutions, like active packaging that extends shelf life without compromising food safety. Okay, let's dive into Section 3, extended producer responsibility in the textile sector. Honestly, if you only take one single thing away from this entire explainer, let it be this: extended producer responsibility, or EPR. In the real world of business, the ultimate question always comes down to who pays for the waste. Historically, well, taxpayers paid. But this directive completely flips the script. EPR is a legal framework that strictly enforces the polluter pays principle. Bottom line, if you manufacture, import, or distribute textiles or footwear in the EU, you are now financially and legally responsible for what happens to that product when the consumer finally throws it away. And when I say financially responsible, I mean they are paying for a massive new infrastructure. Producers must now collectively finance the separate collection of used textiles across the entire EU territory. They've got to pay for the professional sorting facilities. They have to pay for the recycling operations. It doesn't stop there. They even have to fund compositional surveys of municipal garbage just to prove their compliance, pay for information campaigns to educate end users, and invest in research and development for circular eco-design. The financial burden has literally completely shifted onto the industry. And this right here perfectly illustrates the real teeth of this new law. eco-modulation. The fees that producers pay into this system, they are not flat rates. The law specifically targets fast fashion and ultra-fast fashion. Think about it. If your business model relies on churning out thousands of low-quality garments every week just for them to end up in a landfill by Tuesday, your EPR fees are going to be heavily penalized. The less environmentally sustainable your product design and business practices are, the harder it will hit your bottom line. It's just a really elegant legal mechanism to make unsustainable fashion financially unviable. The directive also sets up a strict new legal journey for a discarded garment. Here's how it works. Step 1. The moment a garment goes into a collection bin, it is legally considered waste. This is an absolutely crucial legal distinction, mostly to prevent illegal dumping disguised as secondhand exports. Then, step 2, it has to undergo professional screening and sorting. You see, the consumer doesn't get to decide if it's reusable anymore. A trained professional does. And finally, step 3, only after that professional assessment can the item be legally reclassified as fit for reuse. If it doesn't pass, it gets sorted straight for recycling or disposal. But the EU also recognized a major risk here. What happens to the local charity shops that completely rely on used clothes? Well, the directive includes specific legal protections for social economy entities. These massive new corporate-funded producer schemes can't just come in and crush local charities out of the market. Actually, charities must be explicitly included in the collection networks, they're allowed to maintain their own collection points, and the law dictates they must even be given preferential treatment. Which brings us to Section 4, closing the e-commerce free rider loophole. Now, you might be wondering, okay, but what if I just sell t-shirts online from a third country directly to an EU consumer? Can I just dodge these fees? The answer is a resounding no. The new digital accountability rules turn online platforms and fulfillment centers into literal legal gatekeepers. If you want to sell textiles into the EU, you have to join a national producer register. Online platforms, think of those massive online marketplaces we all use, are legally required to obtain your registration info before they even allow you to list a single product. Furthermore, if a fulfillment service provider finds out that a producer's environmental compliance info is inaccurate or missing, they're legally obligated to swiftly suspend their services to that producer. The digital infrastructure is essentially being weaponized to enforce environmental compliance. Finally, let's look at Section 5, the compliance timeline. So when does all this actually happen? Well, for businesses, the clock starts right now. Here is the exact chronological roadmap. By June 2027, all EU member states have to transpose this directive into their own national laws. By April 2028, these massive textile extended producer responsibility schemes must be fully established and totally operational. By December 2029, the Commission will already be reviewing the directive to see if they need to add even stricter targets, or maybe include new materials like carpets and mattresses. And finally, by December 2030, those legally binding 10% and 30% food waste reduction targets we talked about, they absolutely must be met. Which brings us to the end of this explainer, and it leaves us with one vital, really provocative question to think about. Is your supply chain ready to carry the true financial cost of its environmental footprint? Because under Directive 2025/1892, the days of a linear throwaway economy are legally a thing of the past. The era of the circular economy is officially here, and as you can see, it comes with a legally binding price tag. Thank you so much for joining me for this briefing, and I really encourage you to look deeply into your own operations so you're prepared for these monumental shifts.